Thanks very much. I think we need to look at the backdrop to this. I mean, your predecessor, who is in almost every regard a thoroughly decent man, did something which I would regard to be quite indecent, with the support of this House, in the budget, one of the budgets that was passed down in the Convention Centre. The Supreme Court struck down the statutory instruments as being far too restrictive. Basically, you had to be missing a limb almost in order to qualify, as far too restrictive to comply with the Parent Act. And instead of just passing a new statutory instrument and continuing this scheme, the Minister went and changed the primary legislation to make that more restrictive and buried it in the detail of a vote on the budget. It was completely buried. I never heard one mention of it in his speech or in any other speech. And yet that is now the law, and that's what people are relying on, and that's what's precluding people from exercising their independence and their mobility. And you know, you were in the House, Minister, you were in the opposition benches, I was in the government backbenches, when the IBRC could be wound up overnight. It was a huge undertaking, but it was done overnight because it had to be done overnight.
Thank you, Deputy.
So are we as a legislature, and are you as a minister saying that this is not so urgent that it can be done before the end of this year? Because people have waited long enough.
Thanks, Deputies. I believe that this is very urgent. The existing scheme that we have dates back a number of decades. It is outdated. The terminology is outdated. It's not fit for purpose, and we urgently need a new scheme. And I actually support the thrust of what the Ombudsman has said in that regard. So in my role, I have inherited a tax-based scheme, which we will continue to operate until it is replaced by a new, more modern scheme. And I have sought to change the existing scheme to meet the needs of a relatively small number of people who generally have to import a vehicle from the UK because the nature of the adaptations that they have to get done are very, very significant, and they have to be done in the UK, and the tax bill tends to be very large, and we've managed to come up with a solution to that particular issue, but there are more fundamental problems with the scheme overall. The other issue I have direct responsibility for is getting the appeals board back up and running, and as you know, that has been beset with problems. The board resigned, and then a process was gone through to get new members and so on, and then the NRH withdrew from the scheme as the host of the appeals board, but I want to acknowledge their engagement with my department. I am confident now that we will get that back up and running very, very quickly, but that said, it's not the end solution because the level of successful appeals is tiny. I think it's only a couple of %. So what's urgently needed here is a new scheme. The Taoiseach has responded on the floor of the House here, saying that he will convene all of the relevant departments. That would include health, disability, stroke children, transport, my own department, and we have a huge amount of learnings from the existing scheme. There's a lot of knowledge, and when I was trying to work out a solution to the issue that presented for Lee Gath and others, we engaged with the Wheelchair Association, the Disabled Drivers Association, the Revenue Commissioners. We did look back at the history of the scheme, the nature of the applications. So there's a wealth of information there, and like about 30,000 people are currently benefiting from the existing scheme, but it's not an answer in itself. We need a new scheme, and I will do all that I can in my role to make sure that that is brought forward as a matter of urgency.
Thanks very much. Minister, you used the word immediate at least once in your presentation today, so you used the word urgent several times. I don't doubt your commitment to this, I don't doubt your bona fides in this, but I'm afraid, based on the delays to date, I do doubt your government's ability to deliver this in a timely manner. People have waited long enough. A direct question, will you put this on the agenda of the Cabinet next week so that you can come back to myself and Deputy Kenny with a time frame of when a new scheme will be put in place? And if a new scheme will not be put in place by the budget, which will be announced it'll be announced over the summer in drips and drip fed over the summer, probably, if not by yourself, then by some of your ministers who will be consumed with wishful thinking. So to make sure that this is dealt with in the next budget. And if we can't put this new scheme in place, and everyone accepts that's the ideal solution, well then change the budgetary measures that Minister Donohoe brought in to allow for a more open scheme if the replacement cannot be put in place in a timely manner. But we need a time commitment.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy. And look, I've been of the view for quite some time, having examined individual cases, that a tax-based scheme based on the existing criteria for the primary medical cert is not the way forward. And I will continue to operate the existing scheme. We've made one significant improvement. We will get the appeals board back up and running, and I will lend my full support to getting a new scheme which will be a grant-based scheme, which will be needs-based, based on the individual needs of individuals. And of course, it will involve defining the criteria, which is complex and difficult, but it will need to be done. In relation to the cost of disability, I'm very much aware of the report on the cost of disability. The government did respond last year, albeit in the form of a once-off payment, an additional €500 to people in receipt of disability allowance, for example. We'll consider in the lead up to the budget what we can do to provide assistance to people with a disability. But to your question about the Cabinet, Deputy, the Taoiseach has given a commitment. It was only last week on the floor of the Dáil. He will be convening a meeting of the relevant departments to sit down and put in place a process that will lead quickly to a fit-for-purpose modern scheme being developed, and I will provide my full support to that process.